Nadia Jarma. Welcome to Agitate, Educate, Organise Saturday. This is a joint endeavour between Don't Leave Organise and Socialist Tele. So, Matt, what have we got on this week?
Well, this week, Nadia, really pleased to have a really important campaign that is dealing with a just response to the climate crisis. So what this is all about, what this show is all about, is spotlighting campaigns, big and small, that really demonstrate our socialist values so that you can understand how campaigns are put together and support them at the same time. Now, last week we had a really great example of a real kind of local grassroots campaign that was supported by a national trade union. This one is, this is a big campaign, this is a national campaign, but there's still stuff you can do locally and there's still ways you can engage with it. And it's really important for your community. So I'm really pleased with how this interview went, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about it, Nadia. So before we go to that interview, I just want to say again, this is everything's a work in progress. We're learning as we go, and we really want you to let us know what you want to see. If it's a campaign you're involved with, it's a campaign in your area, get in touch with us. You can use info@don'tleaveorganise.org. And there's no campaign that's too big or too small. And we really firmly believe as well, whether you've been in the labour movement and been, active and involved for decades, or been a trade unionist for decades, or you've only just started to, become aware and involved with this stuff, everybody has something to learn. Everybody's got something to learn from one another, and we've got to support one another. So in the spirit of solidarity, that's what we're all about. I'm rambling now, Nadia, so shall we go to the interview?
Yeah, let's get to the interview.
Thanks, Nadia. I think we've all seen over this last year how governments respond to a global crisis. There's been huge variance nationally and even locally in terms of the response, some of it positive, some of it negative. And even about halfway through last year, people were beginning to say, is COVID a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis? Now, I think most people would largely agree that the climate crisis is real, but clearly there's still debate on what's to be done about it. We may be looking at our government's response to COVID, and panic may be starting to set in, but I don't want you to panic, because there is a rational, humane, socialist solution to that problem. And I'm really pleased tonight to be joined by one of the architects of the campaign to lobby and fight for that solution. His name is Chris Saltmarsh. He's one of the co-founders of Labour for a Green New Deal. Chris, really pleased to have you here.
Really to be here.
So Chris, what first drew you into climate politics?
Yeah, I've been involved in climate politics, I guess, for a long time. When in my first week of university, so when I was 18, I joined a fossil fuel divestment campaign. I'd been involved at college in kind of sustainability, kind of organising and stuff, but I think I really joined the climate justice movement when I was 18 in that first week of university. And to be honest with you, I've always been on the left. And so, I've always kind of taken a socialist view of these things. And honestly, obviously there have been environmental activists and climate movements for longer than I've been active. But I always felt that it was, for the scale of the issue that we're talking about, there just wasn't enough attention paid to it, certainly on the left, but, in wider society. And so, compared to other issues, I think a big part of it for me was just, well, someone's got to be doing something about this, pretty urgent, pretty existential crisis. I might as well be one of them.
And it's a response to actually multiple crises, isn't it? My entire adult life, various governments have talked about the need for a new industrial strategy and various things like that. There was much talked about fourth industrial revolution, which doesn't seem to have made any material difference to people's lives. So before we sort of go into really the fine detail, I wonder if you could just for those who don't know, what is a Green New Deal?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right to say that, when we're talking about climate justice, we can't separate it from these other crises. And so, this was really a motivating factor for me when we were setting up Labour for a Green New Deal. It is about responding to the fact that the climate crisis, the crises of economic injustice and inequality, and now the pandemic as well, these all kind of have the same shared roots. So, we can think about capitalism, the profit motive structuring the economy, kind of histories of colonialism. These have all produced these crises. today, and in that sense they have the same solutions, and for us the Green New Deal is a really good way of packaging those solutions up into a kind of workable program, a platform. And in short, a Green New Deal it's an economic mobilization. It's a plan. It's an economic plan to, as I say, mobilize really the entire economy towards these kind of dual aims of rapid decarbonization. So over a kind of 10-year period, but also tackling the inequality crisis, tackling poverty, guaranteeing kind of good, well-paid green jobs, investing in the new industries of the future, and also meeting basic needs. There's no, I think one of our messages is there's no real point in technically solving the climate crisis, decarbonizing, if at the same time we're not meeting basic needs, whether that's housing, energy, food, water, transport, etc.
You're one of the co-founders. How did the campaign come about? Talk us through the sort of genesis of that and how that's built up.
Yeah, well, so we launched officially in March 2019, which was actually only 6 months before the conference, which, I think we made our biggest impact at. We've been working on setting up the campaign for, probably the best part of 6 months before that launch. But, at that point, it was, myself and a few other activists that either I knew or were in kind of similar circles. We'd all kind of straddled the climate movement and the kind of, left Corbyn-aligned left movement, or, the student movement. And I think we had this recognition that from our work in the climate movement, there was probably something missing. There was a gap in the climate movement that we felt needed to be filled around building that solidarity with our comrades in the trade unions, the labour movement, really kind of popularising the idea of climate justice as a left-wing issue that could be made a kind of headline demand. And most importantly, this was a time when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party. We were all incredibly excited by that. But the climate policies were maybe not quite what they should have been. And so we felt there was a big space to come into to really push those further. And there was a lot of energy, in the kind of grassroots among kind of people who'd been energized by Corbyn, a lot of people from the climate movement who'd come into the Labour Party, to really make that push. And so there was a point at which we kept going on about how Labour's climate policy needed to be better. This thing should exist. And there was a moment where we realized no one else was going to do it. So, like with some things, it's on the responsibility of you to make it happen. And so that's what we did. And, we built this organization that we were really, I guess, insistent that wasn't just going to be a flash in the pan or just a Twitter account. We wanted to build a proper organization that over the long term, regardless of who the leader of the Labour Party was, regardless of who the government was, would push for this socialist program of a Green New Deal or climate justice or whatever.
And so, I mean, obviously, you did, as you say, you had a big impact at that conference. Clearly, became for a time part of the agenda for the Labour Party, at least. How does a campaign like this? How do you kind of build and then articulate a strategy, and how do you measure the success of what you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, building a strategy is interesting. I think with any campaign, the first thing you need to do is kind of determine what's your goal. And for us, the goal was, in some ways, it's quite easy. Climate justice, what does that mean? We had a particular vision of it. The kind of sub-aim, I guess, we wanted the Labour Party to be prepared to enter government with this kind of radical Green New Deal platform. And then I guess working back from that, it's just a question of how do you make it happen? What are the routes available to us? What power do we have to exercise them? What power do we have to kind of, make decision makers, take up our demands? We were lucky that in this instance, initially, the decision makers were the leader of the Labour Party. They were broadly on side with us politically. And actually, what we were hearing from them, from Corbyn, from McDonnell, from Rebecca Long-Bailey, they were saying, look, we agree with you on this stuff. What we need is a base of activists to put us in a position where we can do this. We needed, as the activists, to create the conditions for our leaders to lean into this space, because we have to understand that whether it's the leaders of unions or particularly the Labour Party or whoever else, they're getting pressure from lots of different sides. And so Corbyn in that moment, he will have had internal pressure from a PLP that wasn't very supportive, members of the shadow cabinet which had different priorities, less so with Corbyn, but Labour leaders also have pressure from, the business community, maybe the media, certainly trade unions, which will have had different positions. And actually what was missing was an energized, mobilized activist, member base saying, well, our priority is that you have the boldest climate plan that you can. And so I think that's the role that we filled. that was in large part our strategy. But I would describe it as well as maybe being twofold. On the one hand, we really sought to take advantage of the Labour Party's internal democratic structures. I'm sure most people watching will understand that they're very flawed, and so we would pass motions at CLPs, get that through the National Policy Forum, eventually take it to conference and have a vote at conference. The big flaw there is that although conference has a degree of sovereignty, it's not really binding on the Labour leadership to put what is passed at conference to the manifesto. And so we wanted to use that, really kind of push the internal democratic structures as far as they would go, and then have a kind of more external public campaign of building support, pressure, if you like, again, to create those conditions so that, we hadn't just achieved what we wanted in terms of the internal structures, but we created a kind of sense of inevitability and expectation among Labour members and among the public as well, that this was something that was going to become a priority going into the next general election. And that happened to be actually very, very soon after the conference.
And how important was the trade union movement with that? And how did you go about getting the trade union movement on side?
Yeah, look, in the Labour Party, you can't really get anything done without collaboration, solidarity, support of our comrades in the trade unions. And I think, as I said before, one of the real founding ideas of Labour for a Green New Deal was that in the climate movement, they've not done a very good job of building that solidarity with trade unions. But, if we're being honest, if we want to see an energy transition, if we want to see a Green New Deal, it's not just that the trade union support is a nice to have. It's absolutely essential, both practically, but also, politically and morally. And so, it happened over a very short period of time. But, what we were able to do is, I think, forge a kind of a historic unity between the climate movement, climate activists and trade unionists at that conference. So, there were some unions that were maybe primed a bit more to be supportive of kind of what we were bringing. So we worked really closely with the FBU, with the CWU. Matt Rack gave a really good speech at the conference, making it really clear that climate change is an industrial issue for his members, for firefighters, because of the impacts that they have to deal with. But there are other unions for whom there's a very understandable reluctance or distrust among members, among officers, among the leadership of, a lot of what the climate movement is putting forward. Because for a long time, too many people in the climate movement have had this kind of argument of, well, there's no jobs on a dead planet, so, just get in line. But I think what people in the climate movement have failed to do is understand, what the effects of deindustrialization have been. The memory of what happened with the coal mines is still, incredibly strong institutionally in those unions. And there's a big, big worry that the energy transition will mean worse pay and conditions for, workers of the members of those unions. And so, it was impossible. It was always going to be impossible for us to build 100% trust within 6 months. But what we did do is we spoke to them. We let them know kind of where we were coming from. And, we made it really clear that for us, having the solidarity of the trade union movement, putting workers first, making sure it was a real meaningful, just transition that we were fighting for was our absolute priority. I think was a really big part of it. And, for us, we're really clear that this work of building that kind of solidarity and that trust with the labour movement, between the labour movement and the climate movement, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think a lot of the burden of that is on the climate movement. It's on climate activists. So, yeah, I think that conference was just the start. But I think it was really promising that, unanimously, every single trade union delegate voted for a Green New Deal motion at that conference. And so I think what we saw is with the right platform, with the right ideas, we can begin to bring these movements together.
Yeah, and I think it's always, it of course, it's absolutely essential. Trade union movements with us in this, as in all things, really. But I remember I had a conversation, really enlightened me, actually, a conversation with a local comrade who'd been part of the miners' struggle in the 80s, and he said, this, this Green New Deal stuff, it's great, but we should have had this in 84. This is what we should have done. This is the model for how you have a just transition. I think, in a lot of ways, it's open doors we're pushing against. So we've talked about that a little bit. So let's talk about the closed doors. What are some of the big barriers and challenges that you've faced?
I think I mentioned it a bit already, but I think one of the big challenges that we found is, the way the Labour Party is structured isn't always conducive to grassroots member organising. The internal policy process. Under Tony Blair, it was amended so that the National Policy Forum was created. And in reality, what this is it's a big black hole in the middle, so that anything that's coming up from the grassroots, through branches, through CLPs, through union branches, through affiliates, that gets chucked into National Policy Forum, which is it's elected partially. But there's no kind of formal, there's no definite mechanism for things coming out of it. And so if you want to disappear something, send it into National Policy Forum, and then, it doesn't necessarily come out. And then what comes out is a much more curated, kind of set of ideas that may be more consistent with whatever the leadership is.
So you talked a bit about creating this energy and this appetite in the grassroots, which has been really important to this campaign. I think what I'd be interested to know, I think, as I said at the start, I think the vast majority of people now understand climate change is real. It is happening. I mean, obviously there's debate on the scale and speed, but I think there's very few holdouts who are, to be fair, you'll probably never win those people over anyway. Mm-hmm. But I think the sort of, I think a barrier for a lot of people, not necessarily a barrier, but I think it's in terms of, so they understand it in the abstract, but it's understanding what does that mean for my community? What does that look like? How is my town hall going to interpret a green industrial strategy? How is my there might be some people watching this who have a town hall that is a Labour town hall and wants to do Green New Deal at a local level. So I think I've probably asked about 3 or 4 questions there.
Yeah, do my best.
How do you make it sort of real and meaningful at a grassroots level, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the first thing I'd start by saying is the issues that we're talking about will be more or less experienced in the community. And so, in the UK, as an example, there will be some communities that, on the whole, don't really feel the effects of the climate crisis, maybe for 5-10 years. There will be some that already are. We've seen increased flooding and the real devastation of that, homes destroyed, businesses destroyed, the lack of insurance for those things, so people are really losing everything. And it's going to get hotter in the winter. It might get colder. It'll get hotter in the winter. It might also get colder in the winter. It'll definitely get hotter in the summer. And with both of those things, we'll see people will experience fuel poverty. And people will begin to die, or people already die. And
we don't know. I mean, the Atlantic conveyor that keeps Northern Europe temperate could switch off if it's filled up with fresh water from the Arctic, and then suddenly we are Iceland, which a lot of people don't quite get yet.
And I think a big part of this as well is that it's not just a case, one of the issues with climate change is not just a case of, well, it will get hotter, it will get cold, whatever. It's that it will become more erratic. And so we won't be able to plan. And so we might have a really hot February and then a really cold April. And so actually, although most of us are disconnected from our food systems, there will be big impacts on the food system and the ability to grow food and plan agriculture. And so, food systems will be disrupted. And these are all kind of, short to medium term, maybe even long term threats. But I think as well, what I want to be clear on is the Green New Deal it's as much New Deal as green. And so it's as much responding to these, crises of economic injustice as well. And so in communities, there will be poverty. That inevitably is inequality. As I said, fuel poverty, the last year or so, it's been unavoidable, the crisis of kind of food poverty that we've seen. These are all issues that we'll seek to deal with the Green New Deal. What does it look like on that local level? I think, one of the interesting things about this, I think, I always try and make clear is this, there's a national kind of character to the Green New Deal, in that I don't personally think a kind of a local Green New Deal possible. It's a necessarily kind of national program. A lot of the transformations of the economy that need to happen, transforming the energy system, transforming our food system, investment in new technologies, this kind of has to happen, at least be driven by kind of national government. But that doesn't mean there's no scope for an international action, and certainly not for a local action. Because I think one of the things that we do need to see over the next 10 years, we've got a Tory government for the next 3 or 4, who knows what the government will be after that. I think we need to start to see local authorities take more leadership on this issue, not to expect them to deliver an entire Green New Deal on their own, because they just don't have the resources, they just don't have the powers to do that. But I think what we need to start seeing is initiatives, whether that's from the grassroots or local government, to prefigure what we understand the Green New Deal to be. I think one of the issues, there was lots of issues with it, but I think one of the issues in the 2019 election was that a lot of what Labour was putting forward maybe wasn't believable. And that's not because it wasn't realistic or it wasn't well justified, but because people found it hard after a decade of austerity to imagine that a government could or would do some of these things. And I think part of what local governments can do is begin to put into place, begin to trial and test some of the initiatives that we might say, okay, well, with a national Green Deal, we'll scale that. And that will be difficult because, as I say, local governments have been quite restricted, but we can begin to push that. And I think, another thing that I think local authority leaders can begin to do is really, look at what Andy Burnham was doing around the pandemic in Manchester. That came out of a situation where, it wasn't an ideal situation for Manchester. It wasn't being treated well by the national government. And Andy Burnham almost became a campaigner. He became one of the most prominent critics of the government in the country. And I think what we need to see local authority leaders doing is saying, look, we want to play our part in tackling the climate emergency. We want to play our part in delivering a Green New Deal. With this government, we can't, because we don't have the money, we don't have the powers. But this is our plan. This is what we would do. And it's the Tories' fault that it's not happening. And that's why we need a Labour government. And I think we need much more of that. And I think it's a failure of Labour and local government during the austerity decade that didn't happen. I think there was a kind of, the first 5 years, there was a sense of, well, if we roll over, if we're the kind of humane administrators of austerity, we'll be re-elected in 2015, everything will be fine. Obviously, that didn't happen, and it's just become more of a grind, become harder. There's been a kind of inert kind of attitude, but I think there needs to be a kind of renaissance in how Labour and local government acts so that it becomes a campaigning force as much as a kind of administrative force.
And of course, the people watching this have an influence over that. They're able to contact their councillors, they're able to pass motions at their CLPs and at their trades councils and their union branches and all the rest of this. And this all contributes to that. Is that the kind of thing, I'm putting words in your mouth now, is that the kind of thing that you'd like to see?
Absolutely. But also the people watching this can run to be councillors, and they absolutely should. Because what we need is a new generation of leaders in local government for whom one of their priorities is a Green New Deal or climate justice. And within the Labour Party, we've spoken a lot about open selections for MPs. We have open selections for local councillors. And so I think we need to get organised and begin to form blocks within local Labour groups, within local councils of people supportive of a Green New Deal. A lot of those will be councillors who are already elected. A lot of them will be councillors who can seek selection. But if that's not your thing as well, we can't just be selecting councillors to do it and then do it on their own. We need movements to support them, just like we need movements to support MPs to be as radical as possible and bold as possible in local government, whether it's local momentum groups or other kind of left-wing orientations. They need to be rallying around left-wing councillors and Green New Deal supporting councillors and supporting them to go as far as possible. So yeah, all of the things you listed, and actually I think, really taking those leadership positions ourselves and using it to drag our local councils into a position where it's making a positive contribution. Because as I was saying, with founding Labour for a Green New Deal, part of why we did it was because, no one else had and was going to. And I think in this kind of age of crisis, I think one of the things we have to understand is that if you're someone who's switched onto these issues, who has an understanding of the socialist solutions we need to climate crisis, economic crisis, the pandemic, you're probably one of the few people that, is in a great position to go on further and do that. Become a councillor, whether it's stand to be an MP, get active in your trade union branch, run a local campaign, because no one else is going to do it.
Well, support councillors you trust to champion this agenda as well. Of course, that's an important thing to mention. So I just want to finish off. I mean, we talked a bit earlier about what some of the kind of barriers are and all the rest of it. And what do you think's been one of the kind of single most transformative successes of this campaign that's really pushed it forward for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to not think about that moment at conference in 2019, because I think what we demonstrated was that for members of the largest social democratic party in Europe, one of the two parties that realistically will ever be the government under this electoral system in the UK. For the members of that party, with a smartly run campaign and a bold, radical platform, they can really have an influence. And I think for me, as much as, obviously the primary aim was get the Labour Party, get the Labour movement to support a socialist Green New Deal, but I had a really important secondary aim was to demonstrate that it was possible. Because for me, what I want to see, even in this more difficult kind of context in the Labour Party, especially in this more difficult context, is an active, radical, militant membership that is not afraid to put its agenda forward, to organise around it, and to be creative in how it wins its demands. Because, I think there's lots of criticisms of this current Labour leadership, but I think one of the interesting opportunities is that they don't really have many ideas. And so at the moment, they're, being hostile to the left. But I think there will come a moment where they're looking around for what are the policies that we go into the next election on, particularly on climate. They will need a bold set of climate policies. And I think the question is, what are the ideas lying around when they finally do that? What inspiration are they drawing? And I think we have a good opportunity, members have a strong opportunity to put what our priorities are into a position that they can be adopted. We need to create the conditions for that to happen, because any leader, regardless of their political orientation, isn't going to do the things that need to be done to resolve these crises, out of the goodness of their heart. They're going to do them because a movement puts them in a position where they have no other choice.
And I think one of the huge powers of this campaign is that it's offering multiple solutions. It's actually offering solutions to multiple problems. I mean, I think there was almost a sort of tendency up until pretty recently that there was this kind of underlying unspoken assumption, well, it'll probably be all right because the tech billionaires will come up with some massive solution that will suddenly save us. But
they won't.
Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are both putting quite a lot of money into trying to get off the planet, which is sort of indicative of where their thinking's going. And it's really great to see, this people working together in solidarity. It's a real demonstration of socialist values in action. Chris, this has been a really great interview. I've really enjoyed it. Have you got any final words, any kind of way, any call to action for our viewers? What would you like to say?
Yeah, I guess thanks for having me. The last thing I'll say is, Labour for a Green New Deal, we launched close to the beginning of 2019. Our first kind of big moment was at that conference in September 2019. And it's been a tough time since then. We had an election, we had a leadership election, and we've had a pandemic. But we've not gone away because we know that fighting for a socialist Green New Deal through the Labour Party, through the Labour movement, is as important as ever. And so in the next kind of weeks and months, we're going to be really pushing our kind of new strategy, our new approach. We're going to be doubling down on our efforts within the Labour Party. We're going to be working even more closely with trade unions and supporting people to organise through their unions. We've got a great network of local groups. We've got over 30 local groups that are spread right across the country, and they're going to be running really exciting local campaigns. We have a really great internationalism strand because we need to make sure that this is a global fight as well, building solidarity globally. And we're going to be doing a program of political education, both for our own members and kind of more external facing as well. So if any of that is the kind of thing that you're interested in, if you're excited by what we're doing, we need to grow because we're really ambitious, and we need, Labour for a Green New Deal needs to constantly grow. So you can head over to our website, get in touch if you're interested in any of that. And, there will definitely be a role for you in this fight if you're interested.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. So everything that Chris just described there, we'll put links for those. If you didn't already see them on the screen, they'll be in the description wherever you've watched this. Chris, thanks again for your time. Hopefully we'll see you again. You'll be back on the show to talk about these developments later on in the year.
Absolutely, anytime.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So that was Chris Saltmarsh with Green New Deal. Nadia, I thought that was a really, really interesting discussion. I went into that thinking we'd be talking, just about climate issues, but it was really fascinating to me how it actually brought in tons of other stuff that's really relevant to our movement and how we organise. What were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I totally agree, Matt. I think what was really interesting is, the climate crisis that we've seen over the last few years. Obviously, there's the pandemic. And, Chris talks about the root of them being very similar in terms of, like economic injustice and inequality. And I thought, the way that the Labour for a Green New Deal could be a really good platform for working up those solutions, that he drew out in in his kind of conversation was really good, because it's about the economic mobilisation, isn't it, to tackle the crises. I think that's really important that came out.
And I think it's really important as well, like there's this assumption. I talked about this a little bit in the interview that I had with the really great food campaigners that'll be coming up by the next week or the week after, as a little plug for you. But we talked about how there's this like assumption that when there is a big crisis that affects everyone, whether it's something as huge and existential as climate or something like COVID, there's this sort of truism that actually turns out to be total nonsense, that most people will like revert to panic and savagery and they'll eat their neighbours and all the rest of it. And it could not be further from the truth. And we've seen with COVID, haven't we, that spontaneously people's first instinct is to help each other. And that's not charity, that's solidarity. It's like it's ingrained in us. And I think it's really important that people like Chris are articulating that in a way that can be translated into policy as a solution to the climate crisis.
Totally agree. I think, that for me is socialism at the core of community, isn't it? And people often don't know what socialism is, but that, you see it in those times of crises, don't you? Totally agree. But I thought the other thing that was really interesting was when, Chris talked about, there's no point talking about the rapid decarbonisation if you're not going to talk about the housing crisis, the energy, food, water and transport, because they're all interconnected. And I think most people get that. And I think that's why it was such a popular policy. Really. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think the other thing he touched on as well was that energy of people who came into the party around Corbyn and Corbynism, and whether you think there was such a thing as Corbynism, I think it was just socialism personally. But anyway, the point was a big component of that was climate justice, was being inspired by just solutions to the climate crisis. And I think if you look at some of the recent polling and the transformation in fortunes of, some of the other parties, some of the smaller parties, I think that really does demonstrate that Labour has to take a leading role in this.
Yeah, and I think what I really liked as well was how Chris drew out, how the previous leadership, particularly within the party, have been really supportive of this grassroots movement. I think it's really... It's necessary for us to listen to those things because, that we definitely saw that there was a push for these activists, to get the dialogue and debate out into the wider community. So it wasn't just led by politicians; it was led, from the climate activists themselves, which is, where we should be. That for me is a member-led party as well, and that's how we win in those communities. Absolutely. And that's exactly what Don't Leave Organise is all about, isn't it? I mean, that's core. That's why we're here. I think something that we have to talk about is he did touched upon how none of this really works unless you've got a functioning and effective democracy within the Labour Party. Now, I think that was quite timely of him to have said that because a campaign has launched just this week. Do you want to maybe tell us a bit about that? Yeah, so you're right, absolutely timely, isn't it? Because it is about seeing more debate and discussion and democracy within the party. So, there is a new campaign that has got the support of members, MPs, trade unions, groups like Don't Leave Organise, and that is all about reclaiming democracy. So, the hashtag is Reclaim Democracy Recall Conference. Absolutely. That's a really important campaign. I really would urge you, we'll put the hashtag up on the screen just to say that again. That is Reclaim Democracy Recall Conference. If you go and look for that on social media, you'll find lots of resources, lots of information. You can educate yourself about the reasons behind that campaign and what that campaign is trying to achieve. So look, I'm really pleased again to have a really great speaker. I think we'll probably have the campaign we just talked about on at some point as well, if there's an appetite for that out there. Have you got any closing thoughts this week, Nadia? I just think, this is such an important topic, isn't it? Climate justice. I know, obviously, the pandemic has kind of taken over the narrative, after Brexit. But this is something that affects everybody, isn't it? And it's really important. And I can't wait, actually, to see what else Labour for a Green New Deal are going to do throughout the rest of this year. So I think you're definitely right. We should have them back on. Exactly. So look, follow Labour for a Green New Deal. Go and look at their website. Follow them on social media. Support them locally if you can. As Chris said, support candidates that have that set of values.
think about being a candidate yourself. And most importantly, do not go gentle into that good night. Watch Educate, Agitate, Organise every Saturday night. We'll see you next week.